Welcome everyone. I hope everyone's summer is going well. I know my summer break's been off to a good start. Today, I just wanted to talk to you guys about infectious disease modeling and how the coronavirus modeling is being used to make policy decisions. So I'm going to go over my findings, give a brief demonstration, talk about policy, and then a brief opinion piece at the end, and there'll be some time for questions. I'll try my best to provide some answers. Before I start, I just want to go over some background on my independent study. Um, I started the semester with Mr. Fisher, looking at African developing economies, and we were going to try and model how the society would change with women's rights increasing and other societal reform. But after the quarantine was put in place, we decided it'd be more interesting to go in the direction of current events and model the coronavirus pandemic. So here are my findings. Just first off, a little primer before I start my demonstration. On your left, you see an aggregate model with stocks and flows. And then the converters are used to convey information on the numerical relationships between stocks and flows. And then on the right is the agent-based model, which models the individual and their interactions with infected or susceptible people. So I'm just going to briefly go into a demonstration to start it off. I'm going to be building a SIR model. So that means that there is a susceptible stock, an infected stock, and a recovered stock. So people move from one stock to the next through the flows. And you can imagine moving from being a susceptible person to infected is the process of becoming infected. And this is the recovering process. And so we need to define some variables which will influence how we determine how many people are becoming infected. So the first of those is infectivity, which is how likely you are to get the disease when you come in contact with someone who has been infected. And so in this model, we'll be using the number 0.045. 0045, sorry. And then we need to determine how many infected people are making contacts. So we'll just call this contacts. And we also need a contact rate, which is a predetermined number, and it changes with people's behavior, but it can tell us how many contacts per day an individual is making. So if we multiply infected by the contact rate, then we get the number of contacts from infected people, and we'll just say that the contact rate is 85. And then also to prime the model, we'll say that there's 1 million susceptible people, 1 infected person, and 0 recovered people. What we also need to do before we start is use a summation converter to find out the total population. So this adds the susceptible, infected, and recovered because those are the 3 segments of our total population in this model. Now we can use that in combination with susceptible to find out the fraction of people susceptible. So this would just be obviously susceptible divided by total population. Now we can find out how many risky contacts there are, which would be a contact between a susceptible person and an infected person. So if you multiply the number of contacts with the fraction of susceptible people, you get risky contacts. And you can see then how this is used in conjunction with infectivity to determine the rate at which people move through infecting and become infected. And then what's important for determining recovery, which is this flow right here, is both the number of infected people, so we need information from there, and we also need a separate variable we'll call disease duration, and we'll say 14 days. So infected, so this is where that problem I was talking about earlier comes from. You're just taking people out of infected by a fraction every instant, every run, but in reality, you stay in infected for 14 days, and there's also a variation. Not everyone's in there for as long as the other person. So you can use the fraction of people, the contact rate, infectivity, and which one am I? And disease duration. All four of these help you determine the R value of the virus. And so that's a commonly used variable, but it's used by epidemiologists to determine how deadly a virus can be. So we'll just say that these dotted circles are just copies. They're just exact ghost copies of their counterpart variables. And actually, this is just R, because although contact rate, infectivity, and disease duration are constants, fraction of people susceptible changes as the model is run. So you just multiply these together, we get the R value, and then what we actually care about is the initial, the R naught. So we'll just take the initial of this value. So we'll add a display to display the R naught. And then I'll add in graphs. And on this graph here, I'll put infected, recovered, and susceptible. And then I'll add another graph where we can just graph the infecting rate, so we can see how the rate changes over time. And if I, here 1 second. Oh, sorry, I just went over my head. So you also need to set the times. So we'll start at 1 and we'll start at end at 100, and we'll say that our time units are days. And the integration method we're using is Euler. Like I said, it's a way to numerically solve simultaneous differential equations. And so over 100 days, you can see the population goes from almost all susceptible to recovered. There is no deaths in this model. This model specifically is just built very basically to see how a disease could be transmitted. It would be very easy to model in deaths. You would just use a death rate on the infected. But essentially, recovered can be seen as deaths as well, because they're no longer able to transmit. And then this is the infection rate peaks around day 45. So now I also want to show you an easy way to just implement a quarantine. So we'll call this quarantine start. And say quarantine started on day 35. and the quarantine effect was a reduction by half the number of contacts. So we can do this by multiplying. If the time is greater than or after the start of the quarantine, then we'll use the quarantine effect. Else, we'll just use 1. And so this here is day 35, and you can see the quarantine's put into effect. And you also see what people call flattening of the curve, right? So the disease, the number of infected never peaks as high as it did without the quarantine. And that's important because, like, as you may know, that means that the healthcare system has an easier time dealing with the number of infected people. So I'll demonstrate. We'll just increase the time to, say, 1,000 days. Actually, we'll do 500 just. And we change the time that the quarantine starts. So the earlier we make it, this number here of susceptible that remain in the population increases. And also the peak changes. So the later we make the quarantine, the higher the number of infected people there is. You can also see the effect that the quarantine has on the infection rates. So there is a certain time where it basically doesn't mean anything, but it does have an effect around the 30s. So after the first month. So that's a pretty basic SIR model using an aggregate method, but it kind of shows you the concepts of R naught, susceptible, infected, recovered, and how you could go about determining the numbers. This is a more advanced model, and so each one of these boxes is a submodel. And so this is another SIR model, and so here is your susceptible. Once again, all of this is your infected, and here's your recovered. This is like a global quarantine up here, and it's multiple variables, each for the different stage of the disease you could be at. And these stocks look different. They look like sort of conveyors because you actually get a timestamp that follows you through the model. So it's more accurate in that way as well. And this model is, it doesn't stand alone. It's in conjunction with others. So there's a submodel on the healthcare response. So this is a hospital system. And this is modeling the actual healthcare workers becoming infected, because that's another variable you can take into account. And then this is trying to model supply chains and the effects of losing workers. So I'm just showing you this to show you that, like, the standard SIR can be greatly expanded, but it still has the same core concepts. All right, so now that you have some like fundamental understandings of infectious disease modeling, we can delve a little deeper into what's the differences between each model. So the most common are SIR models or SEIR. So the E is just exposed, so it's susceptible, exposed, infected, and recovered. They're very similar. And the main difference, though, is not between aggregate and agent-based models. It's how the models break down metapopulation. So especially in the United States, this is important because there's no federal response. There's a state by state and sometimes county by county. So some models break the population up by state and then run a new model for each state with its own set of conditions on quarantine, how the public behavior, And then the Columbia model, for example, breaks it down even by county because populations during the day and night change in certain counties, and there's movement from one county to the other. So that's all taken into consideration in how simplistic or complex you want to make your model. And as you can see, the graphs are very similar, but they're slightly different. Um, so the MIT model, it assumes that all current interventions for the virus are continued indefinitely. It accounts for some underdetection of the virus, and it has a varied state by state response. And it's the shaded region, which is where 95% of the model's results fall, is quite tight because it has like fewer variables and they're more locked down. Whereas the Columbia University model, it breaks down the population by county, and it also accounts for some states opening up and counties opening up, which would decrease the effectiveness of the quarantine by 25% each week. And it also accounts for some going further into lockdown. So it has more room to change and more variables, so you can get more constructive or destructive interference. And then in the John Hopkins model, it's also broken down state by state. It incorporates current lockdowns, and it assumes that when a lockdown is lifted, its effectiveness decreases by 25% each week as well. And then the most famous is the WashU model. So that one uses anonymous cellular data and current policies to track people's movements. And then it also assumes that people will stay in quarantine for the most part until the virus is almost gone. But the model was drastically changed on May 4th. It was not like that. Like this was before. It was a statistical model mainly, not an infectious disease model. It was repurposed for the virus, and it was just it was overhauled on May 4th because it had fallen short on many of its predictions, which were overly optimistic. And now it's actually one of the more pessimistic models. And so these models are all used in conjunction in an ensemble by the CDC. And right now it's an unweighted ensemble. So you can sort of think of it like weather casting. There's multiple modeling softwares, and you use them all to decide to make your best guess on what's going to happen next. Right now, the CDC is using an unweighted ensemble. So they kind of just take a look at each model from all the universities, which there's dozens of, and they make their best guess on where like the line of best fit between all of those would be. And hopefully that's what they're using to make this policy decisions. And so to further explore how policy decisions are made based on modeling results, here's just a graphic of a feedback loop. So you often hear like scientists created a model and the results showed 2.2 million deaths, which is what the Imperial College models showed in early March. And that was a scenario that the college ran on an older influenza model. And it was based on the idea that what would happen if no state or country was to intervene at all in the pandemic? What would happen if you just let it run its course? And it predicted that in America, 2.2 million people would die. And that number was sort of just taken with, and people ran with it as a story. So as you can see in the middle of the picture, modeling results directly affects policy decisions because after that number, the countries were shut down, people got really scared, and we basically got quarantines and travel bans. And then those policy decisions create new public behavior, which influences real-time scientific data, which was newly becoming available in March because prior to that, it was sort of iffy data from China. And also it creates new modeling conditions that the models have to then take into account and then redo their results. So their results now change because everyone's in quarantine and everyone's acting differently. And then it basically looks like, oh, they overshot before and now they're undershooting because the numbers look really low. And then policy decisions are made, quarantines are lifted, and people go back out with more leniency. And then models show, okay, that's going to result in more deaths. And then it kind of just back and forth in a feedback loop until eventually public behavior and policy sort of flattens out, and that could be flattening out in just staying in quarantine, no movement whatsoever, or it could be flattening out at whatever, we'll just stay sort of without lockdown and just go on with our normal lives. But the models then also get a chance to like have more accurate predictions because the conditions aren't being changed as much. So that's sort of an ideal situation from the standpoint of you're a policymaker, you know that the conditions are a little more stagnant now, and you can sort of think of a way that you can do a slow burn of the population getting the virus, and then you just treat them as they get it instead of waves of people getting the virus. So just to end it off, just this is a note. I searched on June 2nd, I think, coronavirus modeling, and it sort of astounded me the results of how long ago people were talking about it. And so like media attention has shifted, and I completely acknowledge like the social change going on in America right now, but it's sort of interesting how we sort of abandoned science and went back to how the quarantine's affecting our daily lives and how we can go back out there on the world without really looking at what that means in terms of the models and people's safety. So I just kind of encourage everyone after this presentation to take a second look at modeling and look for articles you can find about it, because it's better to stay educated yourself about where the country's headed. And then maybe you can make a change, and hopefully it's for the better. Hopefully we can slow down the spread and continue it slow down and not reverse our work in the quarantine. All right, that's also. Any questions?
So we have a lot of people on here, so I think talking our questions will probably get chaotic. So if you have questions, please type them into the chat window. We have one that came in early, which is the infectivity variable of the agent-based modeling related to R0 of SARS-CoV-2? So I think the question here is, was the modeling using what the R0 number was that was reported in the literature, or is it just for demonstration purposes?
I was sort of using it for demonstration. I got that number a while ago at the beginning of April, so I'm sure it's changed now. But that's sort of just, that model isn't really supposed to show you anything other than a trend and how models are used to gain information on dynamic systems movement, not give you an exact calculation. And so when you change the dynamic system drastically, like you have protests and riots, it's really hard to determine what's going to happen next. So it was sort of just it wasn't exact or scientific, that the infectivity I showed you, or the R0.
I'm going to change security settings, I think. Okay, Laura, you were asking to unmute, so I think you should be able to unmute yourself to ask your question.
All right. Sorry, my question
That's okay.
Hard to type.
That's okay.
Hi, Aneel. Nice to meet you. I think you're in my stats class next year for AP. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, it's super exciting. So Anika and I were doing a very similar independent study on the biostatistics of it, and we talked a lot about R0 and about the modeling, and we were having a little private conversation about the 95% confidence intervals that you're having, or those are 95% confidence intervals for beta, correct, for the slope?
Yeah.
Okay, just to double check. And then our other thing was, how are you maybe measuring success? Were you measuring success in terms of a decrease in infection rate, or were you measuring success in an increase of recovery? Like, what was the models that you looked at? How were they measuring success?
So that actually varied, because some measured infectivity and infection rates, and then others modeled like death rates. So I think that generally the consensus was infection rates going down was success.
And then have you spent any time looking at 538.com, Nate Silver?
That's where I got some of those graphs from.
Yeah, so he spent a lot of time looking at modeling, and he's still modeling. And I was just wondering how much you used, because he said all the models are wrong, which is
Yeah.
actually a very famous quote by George Box, who says all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so he was
Yeah.
trying to pick and choose which ones were in fact useful. Were there any that stood out to you that were the most useful in your research, or that were most cited, or were those overlapped, or were those the same, most cited and most useful?
So I saw a lot of citation of WashU's model, but I also feel that that one lacked the most actual epidemiological knowledge and integration. I feel like the Columbia University and the MIT ones are pretty solid. They're I think that they're based on the most reason with regards to this pandemic instead of just trying to get numbers, which is what I think the WashU model was. But I think that the WashU model now is a little more sound. There are some smaller university models out there which only look at cellular data and they leave the rest as just constants. And so, yeah, I would say Columbia is the most trustworthy in my opinion.
And then my last question was that I believe it was Johns Hopkins that had just recently done a policy roundtable right before the outbreak about how to use models to impact policy. Did you take a look at that?
No, I hadn't heard of that.
It's an interesting study. I would encourage, if you're still interested in reading about it. They did a whole modeling situation and then and they worked with politicians to try and see how they could use science to help impact policy.
Yeah, I mean the main sort of thing I got from this independent study is that models aren't used to get your exact number on what's going to happen. It's not a fortune teller. It's to help you understand the decisions you make, the policy decisions that you make, how the system is going to change over time. But what makes a modeling a virus difficult is you're modeling people, you're modeling people's behavior. So there's sort of unknowns.
Thank you for answering my questions. I will now mute myself.
Okay, so two more. One is, are these models similar to predator-prey modeling?
I'm not familiar with predator-prey modeling, so I can't answer that, but I can get back to you.
That was Dr. Yah. Basically, the further question was just wondering if you have seen the system of differential equations for predator-prey.
No, I haven't, and I'm gonna be honest. I couldn't solve the system of differentiable equations for this either. That's sort of why I use the tool, but no, I'll take a look at predator-prey modeling, Dr. Yah.
Another question, how quickly can a model relay information to help make a policy decision?
So that sort of depends because aggregate models take much less computing power, and so they're much more instantaneous. Whereas if you take a country-wide agent-based model, which you can imagine would take enormous amounts of computing power, it would take longer, but I would say it's pretty much instantaneous. As you saw, it's very easy to dynamically change different aspects of the model and sort of see how that affects your end results. But I don't know how widely used they are right now by the government. I feel like right now what I'm seeing is people get the results of models and then make decisions instead of using the model actively to make the decisions.
Another question. There is some question about how immunity is conferred, that it may vary with the severity of the symptoms. More illness versus asymptomatic may give differing immunities, or even effectiveness of a vaccine along with the slow mutation of the virus. Do these models consider these effects?
I know that some do, but I don't know. I haven't looked. I looked at more models mapping the spread, and they don't always share exactly what they're doing in each university. So I'm sure that they do, but I don't know specifically. I do know that some models break down how many people are being asymptomatic, and they sort of follow people over a longer time, and then they're actively right now changing the models because it does affect transmission rates and things like that. So I'm not totally sure that's my answer.
Along the same lines, do the models take into account antibody testing and how that impacts herd immunity?
So I know that right now we're not really close at all to herd immunity, but I also know that the MIT model takes into account under testing and under detection. Um, and the Columbia model, one of the Columbia models, because there's multiple, does tackle antibody testing and its effects. But Columbia's models are now private. They recently went private, so I'm not sure why either. So you can't access them anymore, which is sort of a bummer.
A question, what is the name of the modeling software you showed at the beginning? I can answer this one. It's called STELLA, and we actually do have a campus site license for it. So anybody interested in playing with us, give us a yell. Another question, if the virus has 3 strains, how does that impact the models? Does it invalidate any of the single strain models?
That's a good question. I'm not sure how much each strain changes the modeling conditions, because then it would obviously affect each model. But if each strain was fairly similar in terms of infectivity and transmission, then it wouldn't. But if you would have to create a model for each strain if the way that a person moves through the disease while they're infected changes, especially an agent-based model, because that is, you sort of create like little houses for people, and you have them stay 6 feet apart for the most part. So, and you have their behavior change while they're infected and while they're not. So that's where it's really important to see how their behavior would or would not change.
Do your models take into account false positives in testing?
I didn't make a model that did, but I think the model that I showed you, the bigger one, it has a section of people who are tested but not contagious or symptomatic. So it's sort of false positive, but not actually. So no.
Do these aggregate models reflect any understanding into how the viruses are so infectious?
No, that's sort of more to do with like the biochemistry, which is what we did with Dr. Bristell in AP chemistry and organic chemistry. I don't really know enough to talk to you about it, but I do know that the primary site where the virus binds is your ACE2 receptors on your cells. And this one has a secondary mechanism as compared to the original SARS virus. Or at least it's different.
Following up on the false positive, do you think the false positive rate is significant enough to matter in these models anyway?
Probably not, because it is an important distinction, because it changes your behavior. Because if you are tested positive, you're going to quarantine yourself, and if you're tested negative, you'll think I can keep going. But I don't think that there's enough false positive tests to make a dent in your population, and I don't think you would see it in any of your graphs really. But I do think it would still be important to integrate, because it's small things like that which can build in constructive interference in these kinds of models where you have simultaneous equations being solved.
Do the models take into account changing weather conditions and the impact of regional climate on the speed of virus spread?
No, I don't think there was any modeling of temperature and its effects. I think research is still being done on to the validity of all claims regarding that. So it's hard to integrate without any sort of constants or concrete data.
This question may go to the more complex model you showed, Aneel. There can be a delay between infection and testing positive. How can this affect the modeling?
Okay, so in that model I showed you, there was those delay converters. So that's actually why you use them, because then you can have a person you can have half the people just go through. I'll actually show the screen again, because If you see, it looks like there's multiple models stacked on top of each other. So the population is arrayed into the severity of their disease, and then they're sort of taken on these delay converters. So that allows you to integrate the delay between your knowing you're tested or not.
Let's see. Initially, there was discussion that people could get sick with the coronavirus, recover, and then catch it again. Do the models account for this?
I'm not sure about. I do remember hearing about that, but I also think that it may have been that the person never fully recovered. But I don't. The models, the SIR models, don't account for becoming reinfected, because when the assumption is once you're recovered, you're sort of out of the population of people that the model is concerned with, which is sort of why there's also no deaths. So I don't know about catching the virus a second time.
Okay, we seem to be good with questions. So thank you very much, Aneel. That was awesome. Thank you, everyone, for coming. We had quite an audience. I tried to record this, so I think I missed the first bit, but thank you all very much, and good job, Aneel.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great presentation.
Thank you very much.
It's awesome work, Aneel. And if you have any questions about testing, I may have a contact for you out in California who works for a testing company, but they don't do the nose, they do the swab, but they do it for LA County. So if you ever want to, if you wanted to explore further, you can just shoot me an email.
Okay, thank you very much.
Of course.
Aneel, I was just going to mention that those as soon as I started seeing those curves, it reminded me of these dynamical systems that I studied with these predator prey models. They're kind of fascinating, and they're similar in the sense that you have this exponential growth if there's no predator. But what happens is that the predator in this case becomes the fact, things like quarantining and whatever changes how things happen. And they have these models that I think I can't remember all the names, of like Volterra equations and different types of equations that you can look up in a dynamical systems book. You'll see some of the graphs that are somewhat similar. It's quite fascinating.
And one thing,
these models are super complex, and the parameters that are in them are very complex. And so obviously there's no way we can solve these. These are all done numerically. This is all, it's not just something that's simple, but it is very interesting from the differential equations perspective.
Regarding that, one thing I forgot to mention was that it's basically a balance of equalizing and destructive feedback loops. Basically, that's what the model is. So you have lots of little feedback loops acting in opposite directions.
Well, thank you. Good job.
Right. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Bye.